The stagecoach lay on its side in a ditch 3 miles outside Meridian Gulch, Colorado, one wheel still spinning lazily in the September wind. And that was how Walter Wallace found Ada Keller, sitting in the dust beside the wreckage with a violin case clutched to her chest as though it were the only solid thing left in the world. It was the autumn of 1878, and the road through the mountains had never been kind to travelers, but the storm that had come through the night before had turned the pass into a river of mud, and the driver, half-blind with rain and exhaustion, had misjudged the turn near Widow's Curve. 2 horses had broken free and bolted. The driver himself had a broken arm and was already being tended to by a rancher who had happened along before Walter arrived, and the other passengers, an elderly couple bound for Denver, were shaken but unhurt. Ada Keller had escaped without a scratch on her body, but her hands trembled as she opened the case on her lap, and when she saw what was inside, a sound came out of her that was worse than crying, a low broken moan that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than grief over wood and strings. Walter Wallace was not a man who often came down from his cabin in the high country, but he had been riding to Meridian Gulch for supplies when he heard the commotion and saw the overturned coach from the ridge above. He came down the slope on his big roan gelding, Samson, with the easy, loose-limbed grace of a man who had spent 28 years learning every inch of that mountain, and when he dismounted, he moved among the wreckage with the calm efficiency of someone who had seen worse and knew what needed doing first. He checked the driver's arm, helped the elderly couple to their feet, and only then did he crouch down beside the young woman sitting in the mud with the shattered violin. "You hurt, miss?" he asked, and his voice was low and rough like river stone, but there was a gentleness underneath it that made Ada look up at him properly for the first time. She saw a man built like the mountains themselves, broad through the shoulders, his forearms thick with muscle from years of chopping wood and hauling timber, his dark hair grown past his collar in a way that spoke of a man who lived too far from any barber to care. His face was weathered by sun and wind, a short beard shadowing his jaw, but his eyes were a startling pale blue, the color of a winter sky just before snow, and they were looking at her now with a concern that seemed entirely unfeigned. "I am not hurt," she managed, though her voice cracked on the words. "But my violin, it is broken. It is ruined." Walter's gaze dropped to the instrument in her lap, and he saw the crack running along the belly of it, a long, ugly split where it must have struck the corner of the coach as it rolled, and the bridge had snapped clean off, and one of the pegs had torn loose from its socket, leaving the strings hanging loose and useless. "That is a bad break," he admitted, because he was not a man who believed in false comfort, but it is not beyond mending if you know someone with the right hands for it. "I do not know anyone in this territory," Ada said, and there was such despair in the way she said it that Walter felt something shift in his chest, an unfamiliar tug of protectiveness toward a stranger. "I have only just arrived. I was to meet my betrothed in Meridian Gulch. We are to be married in 3 weeks' time, and I promised him I would play at our wedding, the same song his mother used to play at her own wedding before she passed. It was the one thing I had that was truly mine to give him." Walter studied her for a long moment. She could not have been more than 22 years old, with dark auburn hair coming loose from its pins, and brown eyes that, despite the tears standing in them, held a kind of steel he recognized from his own reflection in still water on hard mornings. She was travel-worn and shaken, her dress spattered with mud, but there was a dignity to the way she held herself even now, sitting in a ditch with a broken instrument in her lap. "Who's the lucky man?" Walter asked, mostly to keep her talking, to keep her mind from the wreckage around her. "Harlan Cobb," Ada said. "He owns the mercantile in Meridian Gulch. We have been writing letters for near 2 years, ever since his sister, who was a friend of mine back in Missouri, thought we might suit. He sent for me when his store began to prosper enough to support a wife." Something in Walter's memory stirred at the name. He had traded at Cobb's mercantile more than a few times over the years, and the picture that came to mind of Harlan Cobb was not an unkind one, a portly, balding man in his 40s with an easy laugh, but Walter kept his thoughts to himself. It was not his business to judge a woman's choice of husband, not on the day she'd nearly died in a coach wreck. "Well," Walter said instead, rising and offering her his hand, "there's a man in these parts might could fix that violin of yours. Does fine work with wood and with his hands generally. Name's Walter Wallace." Ada looked up at the offered hand, broad and calloused and scarred in places from axework and rope burn, and after a moment's hesitation she took it, and he pulled her to her feet with an ease that suggested he had lifted far heavier things than one slight young woman. "You are Walter Wallace," she said, understanding dawning slowly. "You mean yourself. I have some skill at fixing things that break," he said, with the barest hint of a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Fiddles included, though I'll admit it's been some years since I tried my hand at one." "I could not ask that of a stranger," Ada said, though the hope in her voice betrayed how much she wanted to. "You are not asking," Walter said. "I am offering. There is a difference, and it would be a poor kind of mountain if it did not offer help to a woman stranded on its road with a broken heart and a broken fiddle both." The elderly couple, the Pruitts, insisted they were fine to continue on to Meridian Gulch once another coach could be arranged, and the driver, though pale with pain, assured everyone he would manage with his arm splinted by the rancher who'd stopped to help. But Ada's trunk, containing her few possessions, had been thrown clear of the coach and lay half buried in the mud, and it was clear she would need somewhere to go while the matter of the wedding and the transportation into town was sorted. "Meridian Gulch is another 6 miles on," Walter said, looking at the darkening sky. "That storm last night was not the last of it, I'd wager. There's more weather coming down off the peaks, and that road will be a misery of mud before you're halfway there. My cabin is closer, not 2 miles up the mountain trail. You would be dry there and safe, and I could look at your violin properly with my tools, and by morning, if the road has settled some, I will see you into town myself." Ada hesitated. She had been raised properly in a respectable household in Missouri, and the thought of spending a night alone in a stranger's cabin, however kindly he seemed, went against every rule of propriety she had been taught. But the sky above the peaks was already darkening to the color of a bruise, and the wind carried the particular cold bite that promised more rain, or worse, an early mountain snow, and the alternative was to sit in the wreckage of the coach or walk 6 miles through mud that might swallow her boots whole. "I do not wish to impose," she said carefully. "You would not be imposing," Walter said, "and I promise you I am a decent man. There is a spare room, was my mother's when she stayed with me before she passed, and it has not been touched since, but the bed is sound and the blankets are warm. You would be safe there, Miss Keller. I give you my word on that." The way he said her name, having learned it only moments before, and the plain honesty in his pale blue eyes, settled something in Ada's chest. She thought of Harlan Cobb, whom she had never met in person, only through letters that were kind but formal, careful in the way of a man writing to a stranger he hoped to marry, and she thought that whatever waited for her in Meridian Gulch could wait one more night while the mountain decided whether to storm. "Thank you, Mr. Wallace," she said. "I accept your kindness." He helped her retrieve what could be salvaged from her trunk, wrapped the broken violin carefully in a blanket from his saddlebag, as though it were an injured child, and helped her onto Samson's broad back before swinging up behind her, one strong arm coming around her waist to steady her as the horse began the climb up the mountain trail. Ada was intensely aware of the solid warmth of him behind her, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath, the strength in the arm that held her secure against the horse's movement, and she told herself it meant nothing, that she was simply grateful for a stranger's kindness on a hard day, and tried not to notice how safe she felt against him. The cabin, when they reached it, surprised her. She had expected something rough and half-finished, the dwelling of a man who lived alone in the wilderness, but Walter Wallace's home was solid and well-built, with a proper stone chimney and glass in the windows. And inside, though sparse, it was clean and orderly, with a workbench along one wall covered in tools she did not recognize, chisels and small planes and things for shaping wood, and shelves that held not just practical goods but a few books as well, their spines worn soft with reading. "You built this yourself," Ada said, looking around with genuine admiration. "Took me the better part of 3 years," Walter admitted, setting down her trunk and moving to build up the fire in the hearth. "I came out here in '72, after the war took most everything I had back in Kentucky. My pa's farm went to the bank, my ma passed the year after, and there was nothing left for me there but bad memories. So I came west, like a lot of men did, looking for something that was mine and mine alone. And you found it here." "I found peace here," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that told her peace had been hard-won. "The mountain does not ask questions of a man. It only asks that he work honest and respect what it gives him." That was enough for me for a long while. Ada settled into the chair he offered near the fire, grateful for its warmth after the chill of the ride, and watched as Walter unwrapped the violin from its blanket and laid it gently on his workbench, turning it over with careful hands to assess the damage in the lamplight. "This was your mother's fiddle," he said, noticing the initials carved faintly into the wood near the scroll. "E.K. My mother, Ada Keller," Ada confirmed, her voice softening. "She passed when I was 16, of a fever that took half our town that winter. This violin was hers, and before that it belonged to her mother, who brought it over from Germany. She taught me to play on it, sitting in her lap, before I was even tall enough to hold it properly myself." Ada's fingers twisted together in her lap. "I promised myself I would play it at my wedding, the same waltz she played at hers. It felt like a way of bringing her there with me, since she could not be there herself." Walter looked at the crack running through the aged wood, at the broken bridge and the torn peg, and understood suddenly that this was not merely an instrument to be repaired, but a thread connecting a young woman to a mother she had lost too soon, and to a future she was riding toward with more courage than most men he knew. "I will do everything in my power to mend it properly," he said, and the solemn weight in his voice made it sound almost like a vow. "It will take some days and some care, but wood remembers its shape, Miss Keller, if you treat it gentle enough while it heals. I have mended worse breaks than this." "You have 3 weeks," Ada said. "That is when the wedding is to be. 3 weeks is enough time if the weather cooperates and I do not rush the glue," Walter said. "But you will need to be patient. And you may need to stay closer to town than you had planned, if the roads remain difficult." That night, Ada slept in the small room that had belonged to Walter's mother, beneath quilts that smelled faintly of cedar and lamp oil. And though the wind howled outside and rain began to lash against the glass windows, just as Walter had predicted, she felt safer than she had in weeks, ever since she had left Missouri on a journey toward a man she had never met, trusting only letters and her friend's assurance that Harlan Cobb was a good man who would treat her well. In the front room, Walter sat late into the night by lamplight, studying the broken violin with the same careful attention he gave to anything worth mending, running his rough fingers along the crack in the wood, already planning in his mind how he would clamp it, what grain of wood he might need to fashion a new bridge. And though he told himself it was simply a task, a kindness offered to a stranger in need, some part of him already knew that the woman sleeping in his mother's old room had unsettled something in his chest that had lain quiet and undisturbed for a very long time. The following morning dawned clear, though the trail below the cabin remained a churned ribbon of mud that made the journey down treacherous. And Walter, after examining the sky and consulting the almanac he kept nailed by the door, declared that they would wait one more day before attempting the ride into Meridian Gulch, to let the ground firm up and reduce the risk to the horse and to Ada both. Ada, though anxious about Harlan Cobb waiting for word of her arrival, could not argue with the plain good sense of the suggestion, and so She found herself with an unexpected day to fill in the company of a mountain man she had known for less than a full turn of the sun. She spent the morning watching him work at his bench, marveling at the delicacy with which those enormous, scarred hands handled the fragile wood of her mother's violin, sanding down the edges of the crack so the two pieces would fit seamlessly together again, mixing a hide glue over the small fire he kept burning for the purpose, his brow furrowed in concentration that seemed at odds with the raw physical power evident in every line of his body. "You have gentle hands for such a large man," she observed, sitting across the workbench from him with a cup of coffee warming her palms. Walter glanced up, something like surprise crossing his features, as though he had not expected to be complimented in such a manner. "A man learns to be gentle with wood if he wants it to hold true," he said. "Force it and it splits along the grain and you have ruined the piece entire. But coax it, give it time to remember its shape, and it will mend stronger than it broke most times." "Is that how you learned carpentry, working with your father on the farm?" "Some of it," Walter said. "But most of what I know of fine work, I taught myself out here, from books, and from a lot of ruined pieces of wood before I got it right." There was not much else to do on winter nights when the snow closed the pass and a man could not leave his cabin for weeks at a stretch. "I built most every piece of furniture you see here." He gestured around the room at the sturdy table, the shelves, the chair Ada currently sat in. "It was that or go half mad from the silence." "Were you ever lonely out here by yourself?" Ada asked, and then flushed, worried the question was too forward for a woman who had known the man less than a day. But Walter did not seem offended. He set down the small plane he had been using and considered the question seriously, as he seemed to consider most things. "There were times," he admitted. "Winters mostly. A man can talk to his horse and his dog only so much before he starts wondering if he has forgotten how to talk to people at all. I would come down to Meridian Gulch time to time, trade at the mercantile, hear the news, remind myself the rest of the world still turned even when I could not see it from my window. But mostly, yes, it has been a lonely kind of life these 6 years." "Then why not marry?" Ada asked. "Surely there are women in the territory who would welcome a husband with a fine cabin and steady hands." Something flickered across Walter's face, quickly suppressed, and he returned his attention to the violin with perhaps more focus than the task strictly required. "There was a woman once," he said finally, "back in Kentucky before the war took everything. Her name was Sarah. We were to be married when I came home from the fighting. But I came home to find she had married another man in my absence, believing the reports that I had died at Chickamauga, along with half my company. By the time the truth reached her, she was already carrying his child, and there was nothing to be done but let her be happy with the life she had built. I do not fault her for it. War makes widows of women whose husbands are not even dead yet, but it left me disinclined to trust easily after that, and the mountain has been easier company than most people since." Ada felt a pang of sympathy that surprised her with its intensity. "I am sorry. That must have been a terrible thing to come home to." "It was a long time ago," Walter said, though the set of his jaw suggested the wound, while old, had never fully closed. "I have made my peace with it mostly. The mountain gave me something to build instead of something to mourn, and that has been enough, until now." He did not elaborate on what he meant by that last word, and Ada did not press him, though she felt its weight settle between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples she could not yet name. They spent the remainder of the day in easy conversation, Ada telling him of her childhood in Missouri, of her mother's death and her father's subsequent remarriage to a woman who, while not unkind, had never quite known what to make of a stepdaughter who preferred books and music to housekeeping and gossip, and of her friend Louisa Cobb, whose brother Harlan had begun writing to Ada after seeing a photograph Louisa kept on her mantel. "He seems a decent man from his letters," Ada said, though there was something careful in the way she said it, as though trying to convince herself as much as Walter. "Steady, hard-working. He built his mercantile from nothing after his first wife passed some years back, and Louisa says he is kind to a fault, that he simply wants a home again, a family, someone to share his life with. Those are fine qualities in a husband, Walter said, though something in his tone made Ada look up sharply. You disapprove. I do not know the man well enough to approve or disapprove, Walter said carefully. I have traded at his store. He always seemed fair in his dealings. But I will say this, Miss Keller, and you may think me forward for saying it. A marriage built on letters and second-hand recommendations is a fragile thing, if there is no true feeling underneath it. I would hope, for your sake, that when you meet him proper, there is more between you than convenience and a friend's good word. Ada did not have a ready answer for that, because in truth, she had wondered the very same thing during the long weeks of travel from Missouri, staring out the window of trains and coaches at the endless landscape rolling past, wondering if she was making the greatest decision of her life based on nothing more substantial than a handful of careful letters and her own desperate hope for a life of her own. Away from a stepmother's cool indifference, and a father, too, occupied with his new family, to notice his daughter had grown into a woman who deserved more than being an afterthought in her own home. That night, as the second evening of her stay settled over the mountain, Walter cooked a simple supper of beans and salt pork and cornbread, and they ate together at his sturdy table. And afterward, as the fire crackled low and the wind had finally quieted outside, Ada found herself asking him to tell her more of his life, of the war, of the mountains, of anything at all, simply for the pleasure of hearing his rough, gentle voice fill the quiet cabin. And Walter, who had spent so many silent winters alone that he had nearly forgotten the particular comfort of conversation, found himself talking more freely than he had in years. The next morning, the road had firmed enough for safe travel, and Walter saddled Samson while Ada gathered her few belongings, and though neither of them spoke of it directly, there was a reluctance in the way they moved, a slowness to the packing and preparing that had nothing to do with the actual time required for the tasks. I will bring the violin to town myself, once it is properly mended, Walter said, as he helped her onto the horse before mounting behind her. It should not take longer than the 3 weeks you have, if the weather holds fair. Thank you, Walter, Ada said, and it was the first time she had used his given name rather than his surname, and she felt him go very still behind her for just a moment before he clicked his tongue to urge Samson forward. It is no trouble, he said, though his voice had gone rougher than usual. I would do the same for any traveler in need. But they both knew, though neither said it aloud, that this had already become something more than simple charity offered to a stranger. Meridian Gulch, when they arrived, proved to be a modest but bustling mining town, its main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a bank, a church with a steeple visible from a good distance, and Cobb's Mercantile, its painted sign swinging gently in the mountain breeze. Word had already reached town of the coach wreck, carried by the rancher who had first stopped to help, and so when Walter helped Ada down from Samson in front of the Mercantile, a crowd of curious onlookers had already gathered, and among them, pushing forward with evident relief and concern, was a stout man in his 40s with thinning hair and kind, worried eyes. Miss Keller, Harlan Cobb said, taking both her hands in his own, thank the Lord you are unharmed. When word came of the wreck, I feared the worst. I am quite well, Mr. Cobb, Ada said, and there was warmth in her voice, genuine relief at finally meeting the man she had corresponded with for so long, though Walter, standing slightly apart with Samson's reins in his hand, noticed that the warmth held nothing of the particular current that had run between the two of them during their 2 days together on the mountain. Mr. Wallace here was kind enough to see me safely through the storm, and he has taken my mother's violin to mend, as it was damaged in the accident. Harlan turned his attention to Walter for the first time, and something like recognition passed over his features. Wallace, I know your face from the store. You are the mountain man who traded furs with me last winter. That would be me, Walter said, extending his hand, which Harlan shook firmly. I am in your debt, sir, for looking after my betrothed, Harlan said. Please, Allow me to compensate you for your trouble and for whatever materials you require to mend her instrument." "That is not necessary," Walter said, perhaps more quickly than the situation required. "It is a small thing to help a traveler in distress. I will bring the violin round once it is finished, and we will call the matter settled." There was something in the exchange that Ada noticed but could not quite name, a subtle tension in the set of Walter's shoulders, the careful neutrality of his expression, and though she told herself it meant nothing, some small part of her heart ached at the sight of him turning to remount his horse and ride back toward the mountain trail, leaving her standing in the dusty street beside the man she had traveled 2,000 miles to marry. The following days passed in a blur of preparation for Ada, as she settled into the small room above the mercantile that Harlan had arranged for her, chaperoned properly by his Aunt Prudence Cobb, who had come to stay for the wedding and to lend the proceedings the necessary respectability. Harlan proved to be exactly as his letters had suggested, kind and steady and unfailingly polite, taking her on walks through town in the evenings, introducing her to the small circle of Meridian Gulch society, ensuring she had everything she needed for her comfort. He was, by any reasonable measure, a good man, and Ada told herself repeatedly that she was fortunate to have found such a match, that many women crossing the frontier to marry men they had never met found far worse than steady kindness and a prosperous business. And yet, in the quiet hours before sleep, she found her thoughts drifting inevitably to the mountain cabin 2 miles up the trail, to pale blue eyes and rough, gentle hands working careful magic on broken wood, to a voice like river stone that had made her feel, in the span of 2 short days, more truly seen than she had felt in years of careful letters and dutiful conversation. 10 days after her arrival in Meridian Gulch, Walter Wallace rode into town with the violin case strapped carefully behind his saddle, and word of his arrival reached Ada before he himself did, sent running by one of the mercantile's young clerks who had spotted the mountain man's distinctive roan gelding coming down the main street. She met him outside the mercantile, her heart beating faster than the occasion strictly warranted, and watched as he dismounted and unstrapped the case with the same careful attention he had shown the violin from the first moment he had assessed its damage. "I believe I have mended it properly," he said, handing her the case. "But you will want to test it yourself to be certain." Ada opened the case with trembling fingers, and there, resting in the worn velvet lining, was her mother's violin, the crack along its belly now invisible beneath careful sanding and a fresh coat of varnish that matched the original so precisely she could not tell where the mend had occurred, the bridge replaced with new wood shaped to match the original's exact dimensions, the peg reset firmly in its socket, new strings gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. "Walter," she breathed, unable to say more for a moment as emotion rose in her throat, "it looks as though it was never broken at all." "The wood remembered its shape," he said simply, though there was clear pride in his eyes at her reaction. "As I told you it would, given proper time and care." She lifted the violin from its case and settled it beneath her chin, drawing the bow across the strings in a tentative first note, and then, as the sound rang true and clear and beautiful, breaking into the opening bars of the waltz her mother had taught her, the same one Ada Keller had played at her own wedding decades before. The melody drifted out into the street, drawing the attention of passers-by, and Ada played with her eyes closed, tears slipping down her cheeks as she felt, for just a moment, as though her mother stood beside her once more. When she finished, she opened her eyes to find Walter watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something between wonder and sorrow, and she understood in that moment that he was thinking of the wedding this violin would play at, and the man who would stand beside her when it did, and that man was not himself. "It plays beautifully," she said, lowering the instrument. "Thank you, Walter. I do not know how I will ever repay such kindness." "There is no debt between us, Miss Keller," Walter said, though his voice had gone rough again in that particular way she was beginning to recognize as a sign he was holding something back. I am glad the mend held true. It is all the payment I require to see you play it so well." Harlan Cobb emerged from the mercantile at that moment, drawn by the sound of music, and his face lit with genuine pleasure at the sight of Ada with her restored violin. "That is a fine piece of work, Wallace," Harlan said, examining the instrument with evident admiration. "I could hardly tell it had ever been damaged. You have a real gift with your hands." "I am glad it pleases you both," Walter said, though his eyes remained on Ada rather than the violin. "I should be getting back. There is work waiting at the cabin, and the light will not last forever." "You must stay for supper, at least," Harlan insisted, with the easy hospitality of a man unaware of the currents running beneath the surface of the conversation. "It is the least we can offer, after your kindness to Miss Keller." Walter hesitated, his gaze flicking briefly to Ada, who found herself holding her breath without quite understanding why. "I would not wish to impose on your time before the wedding," he said finally. "But I thank you for the offer, perhaps another time." He mounted Samson with the same easy grace Ada remembered from their first meeting, and as he turned the horse back toward the mountain trail, he glanced back once, just once, and his eyes met Ada's across the dusty street. And in that brief exchange passed something neither of them could yet name aloud, something that felt dangerously close to grief for a thing that had never quite had the chance to become what it might have been. The days that followed passed with the particular quickened rhythm of wedding preparations, dress fittings and menu planning, and the arrangement of the small church for the ceremony. And Ada found herself swept along in the current of it, smiling and nodding and playing the part expected of her, while some quiet, persistent part of her heart remained turned toward the mountain, wondering what Walter Wallace was doing in his solitary cabin, whether he thought of her at all, or whether their 2 days together had already faded for him into simply another act of frontier kindness, forgotten as easily as it had been offered. She practiced the waltz daily on her Mended violin, and each time she played it, she found herself thinking not of her mother, as she had intended, but of rough, careful hands shaping new wood to fit an old wound, of pale blue eyes watching her with an expression she was beginning to understand meant something far more significant than she had allowed herself to admit. It was Louisa Cobb, arriving from a neighboring town 2 weeks before the wedding to help with preparations, and to reunite with the friend whose match she had helped arrange, who first noticed something amiss in Ada's demeanor. "You seem distracted, dearest," Louisa observed, as the two women sat together in Ada's small room above the mercantile, working on the final alterations to the wedding dress. "Is something troubling you? Harlan has not said anything unkind, I hope." "No, nothing of the sort," Ada said quickly. "Harlan has been every bit as kind as his letters promised. I could not ask for a better match by any reasonable measure." "By any reasonable measure," Louisa repeated, catching the particular phrasing with the sharp attention of a lifelong friend. "That is a curious way to speak of your own betrothed, 3 days before your wedding." Ada set down her needle, unable to maintain the pretense any longer under her friend's knowing gaze. "There is a man," she admitted quietly, "a mountain man who mended my violin after the coach accident. I stayed 2 nights in his cabin, quite properly, I assure you, but in that short time I felt something I have never felt with Harlan, despite 2 years of letters." Louisa's eyebrows rose. "And what do you intend to do about this feeling?" "Nothing," Ada said firmly, though her voice wavered on the word. "I have made a commitment to Harlan, and he is a good man, and I will not dishonor that commitment on the strength of 2 days' acquaintance with another man, however he might have unsettled me. It would be foolish, and cruel to Harlan besides, who has done nothing to deserve such treatment." "Foolish," Louisa said slowly, "or perhaps the most honest thing you have felt in the whole of this arrangement. Ada, I love my brother, but I would not wish you to marry him out of obligation alone, if your heart lies elsewhere. That would be no kindness to either of you in the end." Ada had no ready answer for that, and the conversation moved on to safer topics, but Louis's words lingered in her mind long after her friend had gone to bed, and Ada lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small room, wondering if she was making a terrible mistake, or simply suffering a passing fancy that would fade once she had settled properly into married life. Meanwhile, up on the mountain, Walter Wallace found himself equally unable to settle back into the solitary rhythm that had sustained him for 6 years. The cabin felt too quiet now, the silence he had once found peaceful pressing on him instead like a physical weight, and he found himself, more than once, standing at his workbench with some half-finished project before him, his hands still while his mind wandered inevitably back to a woman with auburn hair and steel-brown eyes, playing a waltz on a Mended violin with tears streaming down her face. He told himself repeatedly that it was not his place to interfere, that Ada Keller had made her choice long before their paths ever crossed, that a decent man did not covet another man's betrothed, however unsettled his own heart might have become in the span of 2 short days. But telling himself these things and believing them proved to be 2 very different exercises, and as the wedding date drew closer, Walter found the weight of his own restraint growing heavier with each passing day. It was 9 days before the wedding when circumstances brought them together again, though neither had sought the meeting. Ada had walked out past the edge of town, seeking a moment's solitude from the endless bustle of wedding preparations, following a trail that led toward the base of the mountain without any particular destination in mind, simply needing air and space to think. She had not intended to walk far, but the afternoon was fine, the mountain air crisp and clean after weeks confined to the town's dusty streets, and she found herself walking farther than planned, until she rounded a bend in the trail and found herself face to face with Walter Wallace, who was returning from checking a trap line he maintained along the lower slopes. Both of them stopped short at the unexpected encounter, and for a long moment neither spoke, simply looking at each other with an intensity that made the mountain air feel suddenly charged with something neither could name. "Miss Keller," Walter said finally, breaking the silence. "I did not expect to find you out this far from town." "I needed air," Ada admitted. "The preparations have grown somewhat overwhelming and I wished for a moment's peace." "The wedding is soon, then." 9 days, Ada confirmed, and something in her voice made the number sound less like an anticipation and more like a countdown toward an ending. Walter studied her for a long moment, taking in the shadows beneath her eyes, the tension in her shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and troubled thoughts, and he found he could not simply walk past her as propriety demanded, could not pretend that the past 10 days had not been consumed with thoughts of her that a betrothed man's mountain acquaintance had no right to entertain. "Are you happy, Ada?" he asked, and the use of her given name, spoken for the first time by his own voice rather than repeated back from her earlier invitation, seemed to hang in the air between them with particular weight. The question caught her off guard with its directness, and she found she could not answer immediately, could not summon the easy reassurance she had offered Louis days before. "I do not know how to answer that," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Harlan is a good man. He will make a good husband, steady and kind and capable of providing well for a family. By every reasonable measure, I should be happy and grateful for such a match." "That is not what I asked," Walter said gently, taking a step closer, close enough now that she could see the particular flecks of gray in his pale blue eyes, could smell the clean scent of pine and leather that seemed to cling to him always. "I asked if you are happy, not if you should be, not if it is reasonable, simply if you are." Ada felt tears rising unbidden, and she hated herself for the weakness even as she could not prevent it. "No," she admitted, the word breaking something open in her chest that she had been holding closed for 10 days through sheer force of will. "I am not happy, Walter. I have not been happy since I left your cabin, and I do not know what to do about it because I have made promises, and Harlan has done nothing wrong, and it would be cruel and foolish to abandon a good match for a feeling I cannot even properly name, born from 2 days' acquaintance with a stranger on a mountain." "It is not foolish," Walter said, his voice rough with an emotion he could no longer fully contain. "Ada, I have thought of nothing but you since you left my cabin. I have told myself 100 times that it is not my place, that you belong to another man's future, that a decent man does not covet what has already been promised elsewhere. But I cannot make myself stop thinking of you, and I do not believe, watching you now, that you have managed to stop thinking of me either." The confession hung between them in the clear mountain air, and Ada felt something in her chest crack open entirely, all the careful walls she had built over the past 10 days crumbling at once. "What are we to do?" she whispered. "I cannot simply abandon Harlan 9 days before our wedding. The shame of it would follow me the rest of my life, and it would humiliate him before the entire town, a man who has done nothing but treat me with kindness and respect." "I do not have an easy answer for that," Walter admitted. "I would not have you act rashly or cause harm to a good man for my sake alone, but I could not let this moment pass without telling you the truth of my feelings, whatever comes of it after. I have spent 6 years alone on that mountain, believing I had made peace with a solitary life, and in 2 days you undid all of that peace simply by existing in my cabin, playing a broken violin with such love in your face that I could not help but wish, selfishly, that I might be the man standing beside you when it finally played whole again." Ada reached out, almost without conscious decision, and touched his forearm, feeling the solid strength of muscle beneath her fingers, and Walter went very still at the contact, as though afraid any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile thing was building between them. "I do not know what is right," she said. "I only know that I feel something with you that I have never felt with Harlan, despite 2 years of letters and every reasonable expectation that our match should suit. But I cannot simply act on feeling alone, Walter. There are real consequences to consider, real people who would be hurt by any decision I make." "I understand," Walter said, though the words seemed to cost him something significant to speak. "I will not press you further or ask you to abandon your commitments on the strength of a mountain confession, but I wanted you to know the truth, whatever you decide to do with it. I love you, Ada Keller. I believe I have loved you since the moment I found you sitting in that ditch with your mother's broken violin, refusing to weep for yourself, even as your whole world seemed to be falling apart around you. I will love you whether you marry Harlan Cobb or whether fate decides otherwise, and that love does not require anything of you in return, except perhaps that you allow yourself to be honest about what you truly want, rather than what seems reasonable or expected." They stood together on the mountain trail for a long moment, the weight of his confession settling between them, and then, with visible effort, Walter stepped back, putting proper distance between them once more. "You should return to town," he said, "before your absence is noted and questions asked that neither of us wish to answer." Ada nodded, though every instinct in her body rebelled against the idea of walking away from him now, and she turned back toward Meridian Gulch with her heart in complete disarray, Walter's confession echoing in her mind with every step. That night, Ada lay awake long past midnight, staring at the ceiling of her small room, turning the impossible decision over and over in her mind. She thought of Harlan's kindness, of his patient letters, of the genuine effort he had made to welcome her into his life and his town, and she knew, with painful clarity, that he deserved better than a wife whose heart belonged to another man, however carefully she might try to hide that fact for the rest of their shared lives. She thought too of her mother, of the violin that connected her to Ada Keller's memory, and wondered what her mother would have counseled, faced with such an impossible choice between duty and feeling. By morning she had made her decision, though the weight of it sat heavy in her chest as she dressed and made her way down to the mercantile, where Harlan was already at work arranging a new shipment of goods that had arrived from Denver. "Harlan," she said, and something in her voice must have carried the seriousness of what was to come, because he set down the crate he had been unpacking and turned to face her with immediate concern. "Ada, what is wrong? You look troubled." "I need to speak with you about something important," she said, "and I fear it will cause you pain, for which I am truly sorry, because you have done nothing to deserve such treatment." Harlan's expression grew guarded, though he gestured for her to continue, and Ada found the words easier to speak than she had feared once she finally began. "I cannot marry you, Harlan," she said. "Not because you have failed me in any way, for you have been every bit as kind and steady as your letters promised, and I believe you would have made an excellent husband, and I am grateful, truly grateful, for the home and the welcome you offered me here. But I have come to realize, in the weeks since my arrival, that I do not love you, not in the way a wife should love her husband, and I believe that marrying you regardless would be a disservice to us both, a beginning built on convenience rather than the true affection you deserve to find with someone else." Harlan was silent for a long moment, processing her words, and Ada braced herself for anger or hurt or bitter recrimination, any of which she felt she would deserve after breaking a commitment so close to its fulfillment. "Is there someone else?" Harlan asked finally, his voice quiet but not unkind. "The mountain man, Wallace." Ada flushed but did not deny it. "Yes. I did not seek this feeling, Harlan, and I am ashamed of the timing, so close to our wedding, after everything you have done to prepare for our life together. But I cannot in good conscience marry you while my heart belongs elsewhere, however inconvenient or foolish that feeling might seem." To her surprise, Harlan's expression softened into something almost like relief, rather than the anger she had braced for. "I will admit," he said slowly, "that I had begun to sense something amiss these past weeks. You have been kind to me, Ada, and dutiful, but there has been a distance in your manner that I could not quite name, though I told myself it was simply the natural nervousness of a woman meeting her betrothed for the first time after so many letters. I think, if I am honest with myself, that I sensed the truth before you spoke it aloud. I am so sorry, Harlan. I never meant to cause you such pain or to waste your time with false hope." "You have not wasted my time," Harlan said, with a gentleness that made Ada's guilt sharpen rather than ease. "And I would rather know the truth now, however painful, than discover it years hence, after we had built a life together on an uneven foundation. I confess I am disappointed, Ada, for I had hoped for a genuine partnership between us, but I would not wish to trap you in a marriage where your heart lay elsewhere. That would be a poor kind of happiness for either of us to build a life upon." The conversation, though difficult, ended with something approaching mutual respect, and Harlan, in a display of character that only deepened Ada's guilt even as it eased her conscience somewhat, insisted that she remain welcome to stay in the room above the mercantile until she had determined her next course of action, and that the small dowry he had already prepared for their union would remain available to her regardless, as a gesture of goodwill rather than obligation. News of the broken engagement spread through Meridian Gulch with the particular speed common to small frontier towns, and while some townspeople clucked disapprovingly at what they perceived as fickleness on Ada's part, others, including Louisa Cobb, expressed quiet relief that her friend had chosen honesty over convenient duty. "I am proud of you," Louisa told her, when the news reached her later that same day. "It could not have been easy to speak such a truth to my own brother. But I believe you have done the right thing for both of you. I fear I have caused a great deal of hurt and scandal for nothing more than a feeling I cannot fully explain," Ada said, though there was a lightness in her chest now that had been absent for weeks, the particular relief of finally acting in accordance with her true heart rather than continued obligation. "Feelings such as that," Louisa said, "are rarely nothing. And if this mountain man of yours is even half the man you describe, I suspect you have made the right choice, whatever scandal it might cause in the short term." Word of the broken engagement reached Walter Wallace 3 days later, carried by a trader who passed through the mountain trail on his way to the higher settlements, and when Walter heard the news, he felt something in his chest that had been clenched tight for days finally begin to loosen. though he did not allow himself to hope too fully, uncertain what the broken engagement truly meant for his own prospects, or whether Ada Keller, having escaped one hasty commitment, would wish to rush into another quite so soon. It was Ada herself who resolved his uncertainty, riding up the mountain trail alone 3 days after her conversation with Harlan, having borrowed a horse from the mercantile's small stable, and following the path she remembered from her first journey to Walter's cabin weeks before. She found him at his workbench, as she had somehow known she would, shaping new wood for what appeared to be a chair, and when he looked up and saw her standing in his doorway, the expression that crossed his face was one of such naked hope and disbelief that Ada felt any remaining doubt about her decision simply melt away entirely. "Ada," he said, rising from his bench so quickly he nearly overturned it. "I heard about Cobb. I did not dare hope you would come here after everything." "I could not stay away," she said simply. "You told me you loved me on that mountain trail and asked nothing of me in return except honesty about what I truly wanted. I have spent 3 days searching my own heart, Walter, and I find that what I truly want is you. Not the reasonable match, not the steady provider, not the sensible choice that everyone would applaud. You. If you will still have me, after all the trouble and scandal I have brought to this quiet town." Walter crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into an embrace that left no room for doubt about his feelings, his strong arms wrapping around her with a careful tenderness that belied the raw strength evident in every line of his powerful frame. And Ada felt, for the first time since her mother's death 6 years before, as though she had finally found somewhere she truly belonged. "I have wanted to do this since the moment I pulled you up onto Samson's back," Walter murmured against her hair, "and told myself 100 times over that it was not my place to want such a thing." "It is entirely your place," Ada said, pulling back just far enough to look up into his pale blue eyes, "if I am the one giving you permission." He kissed her then, gently at first, as though afraid she might change her mind or vanish like morning mist, and when she responded with unmistakable warmth, deepening the kiss with a certainty that surprised even herself, Walter's arms tightened around her, and for a long moment the world outside the cabin, with all its scandal and complication and uncertain future, simply ceased to exist. They spent the remainder of that afternoon talking through the practical realities of what would come next, for Walter, despite the overwhelming joy of the moment, was not a man to rush headlong into decisions without proper consideration. "I would not have you marry me out of mere rebound feeling," he said carefully, "or because the alternative seemed too humiliating to bear, returning to Missouri unmarried after such a public scandal. I want you to be certain, Ada, truly certain, that this is what you want, and not simply an escape from an uncomfortable situation." "I have never been more certain of anything," Ada said firmly. "Walter, I did not fall in love with you because I needed an escape from Harlan. I fell in love with you before I ever knew there would need to be an escape, in the span of 2 days on this very mountain, watching you mend a broken violin with more care and gentleness than I believe Harlan Cobb has shown in his entire life, however kind he might be in other respects. This is not rebound feeling. This is the truest thing I have felt in years." Her certainty seemed to ease whatever remaining doubt Walter had harbored, and he nodded slowly, a smile beginning to spread across his weathered features, the first true, unguarded smile Ada had yet seen from him. "Then I would ask you properly, Ada Keller, though I have no ring to offer beyond what I might fashion from silver wire and a bit of skill, and no grand estate beyond this cabin and the mountain around it. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Ada said, without a moment's hesitation, "though I would ask that we wait a decent interval for propriety's sake, given how recently my engagement to Harlan ended. I would not wish to add further scandal to what has already been a difficult few days for this town's gossip." "A month," Walter suggested. "That should satisfy propriety, while not making either of us wait unbearably long." "A month," Ada agreed, and sealed the agreement with another kiss that left them both slightly breathless. The month that followed proved eventful in ways neither of them fully anticipated. Ada moved from her room above the mercantile to stay with a respectable widow in town, Mrs. Agatha Pearson, who had known Walter's mother years before, and welcomed the arrangement with the particular delight of a woman who had missed the excitement of young romance in her own household. Harlan Cobb, to his considerable credit, proved gracious throughout, even offering to host a small reception following the eventual wedding, a gesture that spoke to genuine goodness of character rather than any lingering bitterness. And within weeks, he had begun a tentative courtship of his own with a widow recently arrived from the Eastern Territories, a development that brought Ada considerable relief, knowing that her broken engagement had not left him permanently wounded. Walter, meanwhile, spent the weeks preparing his cabin for its new mistress, adding a proper kitchen with a stove ordered specially from Denver, expanding the small structure with an additional room, and crafting, in whatever spare hours remained, a bed frame carved with delicate patterns of mountain wildflowers, a wedding gift he intended as a surprise for Ada, who knew only that he disappeared for long hours to his workbench without explanation. The wedding itself, when it finally arrived on a crisp October morning 3 weeks after Walter's proposal, took place in the small church at the edge of Meridian Gulch, its modest interior decorated with mountain wildflowers gathered by Louisa Cobb and several other women of the town who had, despite initial gossip, come to embrace the romantic story of a mountain man mending a broken violin and winning a woman's heart in the process. Ada wore a simple dress of pale blue fabric that matched Walter's eyes, sewn with careful attention by Mrs. Pearson and Louisa together, and as she stood at the back of the small church, her mother's violin cradled in her hands, she felt a peace settle over her that had been entirely absent during the anxious weeks leading up to her intended marriage to Harlan. The church was full, far fuller than she had expected given the scandal surrounding her broken engagement, and looking out at the assembled faces, she saw genuine warmth rather than judgment, the particular acceptance of a frontier community that valued authentic happiness over rigid propriety, once the initial shock of unconventional circumstances had settled. Harlan Cobb himself sat near the front, beside the widow he had begun courting, and when Ada's eyes met his briefly, he offered a small, genuine smile of goodwill that eased the last lingering guilt she had carried about the pain her decision had caused him. At the front of the church, Walter Wallace waited, dressed in a fine dark suit that had clearly been tailored for the occasion, his usually loose hair combed back neatly, though it still fell past his collar in the way Ada had come to find so endearing, and his powerful frame seemed to fill the small church with a presence that drew every eye, though his own gaze remained fixed entirely on the doorway, waiting for his first glimpse of his bride. The moment Ada began her walk down the short aisle, violin in hand rather than the traditional bouquet, a hush fell over the assembled guests, and as she reached the front of the church, she lifted the instrument to her chin and began to play the waltz her mother had taught her so many years before, the same melody that had rung out in the dusty street weeks earlier when Walter had first returned her Mended violin. The notes filled the small church with a beauty that brought tears to more than one eye among the assembled guests, and as Ada played, she felt her mother's presence as surely as if Ada Keller stood beside her, blessing this union between her daughter and the mountain man who had mended not just a broken violin, but a broken heart weary from disappointment and loneliness both. When the waltz concluded, Ada lowered the violin and handed it carefully to Louisa, who stood as her attendant, before turning to face Walter properly for the exchange of vows. The minister, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Adams who had come to Meridian Gulch only the previous year, but had quickly earned the respect of the town's residents, began the ceremony with words about love and commitment, and the particular grace required to build a life together in the harsh but beautiful wilderness of the frontier. When the time came for vows, Walter spoke first, his rough voice carrying clearly through the small church, despite the emotion evident beneath its surface. "Ada Keller," he said, taking both her hands in his own. "I did not expect, when I rode down that mountain trail to find a wrecked coach, that I would find the woman who would mend 6 years of loneliness simply by existing in my cabin for 2 short days. I promise you now, before God and this entire town, that I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of the trust you have placed in me. I will build for you a home filled with warmth and safety. I will mend whatever breaks in our life together with the same care I gave to your mother's violin, and I will love you with everything I possess, for as long as breath remains in my body." Ada, her own voice thick with emotion, offered her vows in return. "Walter Wallace, you found me broken beside a wrecked coach, mourning not just an instrument but a piece of my mother I feared I had lost forever. And you mended what was broken with such gentle patience that you taught me, without either of us realizing it at the time, what true love actually looks like. I promise to build a life with you on this mountain, to bring music into whatever home we share together, and to love you as fiercely and completely as you have already shown me you deserve to be loved." The Reverend pronounced them husband and wife to a chorus of joyful applause and more than a few tears among the assembled guests. And when Walter kissed his new bride, the church erupted in cheers that echoed off the mountain peaks visible through the small windows, as though the very land that had brought them together offered its own blessing on their union. The reception that followed, held at Harlan Cobb's own insistence in the space behind his mercantile, proved a joyful affair, with music provided by a local fiddler and enough food to feed the entire town twice over, contributed by neighbors and friends who had, over the preceding weeks, come to embrace the unconventional but undeniably romantic story of their courtship. As the celebration wound down into evening, Walter and Ada slipped away together, riding double on Samson's broad back toward the mountain cabin that would now be their shared home. And as they climbed the familiar trail beneath a sky brilliant with stars, Ada rested her head against Walter's broad chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her ear, and thought that she had never felt so completely, perfectly happy in her entire life. The cabin, when they arrived, had been transformed in ways Ada had not anticipated, decorated with candles and mountain wildflowers by Louisa and Mrs. Pearson while the wedding ceremony proceeded, and in the newly expanded bedroom, the carved bed frame Walter had labored over in secret stood ready, its delicate wildflower patterns catching the candlelight with a beauty that brought fresh tears to Ada's eyes. "You made this," she said, running her fingers over the careful carving, recognizing the same skilled, patient hands that had mended her mother's violin. "For you," Walter confirmed, coming to stand beside her, his arms sliding around her waist from behind. "I wanted our marriage to begin in something built specifically for this new life we are creating together, rather than simply repurposing what came before." "It is beautiful," Ada said, turning in his embrace to face him properly. "You are beautiful, Walter Wallace, in every way that truly matters." That night, as the mountain settled into its familiar nighttime quiet around them, Walter and Ada consummated their marriage with a tenderness that spoke to the genuine depth of feeling that had grown between them. And as they lay together afterward beneath the quilts that had once belonged to Walter's mother, now shared by her son and his new wife, Ada felt a profound sense of homecoming, as though every difficult step of her long journey from Missouri had been leading, all along, toward this particular mountain and this particular man. The years that followed brought their own share of challenges, as frontier life inevitably did, but Walter and Ada faced each difficulty together with the same partnership evident from the earliest days of their acquaintance. The winter following their wedding proved particularly harsh, with snow closing the mountain pass for nearly 6 weeks, but rather than the isolation Walter had once dreaded during his lonely bachelor years, the confinement became instead a season of deepening intimacy, As husband and wife spent long evenings by the fire, Ada playing her Mended violin while Walter worked at his bench crafting furniture and toys they would need for the family they both hoped to build together. That hope was realized the following autumn, when Ada gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas after Walter's father, born during a fierce mountain storm that Walter would later joke had announced the boy's arrival with all the drama the family would come to expect from him as he grew. Thomas proved a robust, cheerful infant, inheriting his father's broad build even as an infant and his mother's dark auburn hair, and Walter's joy at becoming a father, after years believing he might live out his life in solitary bachelorhood, was evident to everyone who witnessed how carefully he held his son, those same rough hands that had mended a broken violin now cradling new life with equal tenderness. 2 years later, a daughter followed, named Elena after Ada's mother, and the little girl grew to share her grandmother's love of music, learning to play the very violin that had brought her parents together, under her mother's patient instruction, from the moment she was old enough to hold a small practice bow. Meridian Gulch itself continued to grow and prosper over the following years, as mining operations expanded, and the railroad eventually extended a spur line to serve the town's needs, bringing new families and new opportunities to the once remote settlement. Harlan Cobb married his widow, a kind woman named Constance, within a year of Ada's own wedding, and the two couples maintained a genuinely warm friendship over the following decades, their children growing up together as playmates despite the unconventional circumstances that had first brought their families into each other's orbit. Walter's skill with woodworking, first demonstrated so memorably in the mending of Ada's violin, grew into a proper business over the years, as word spread through the territory of the mountain man whose careful hands could mend or craft nearly anything from wood. And by the time their children had grown old enough to help in the workshop themselves, Walter Wallace had become known throughout the region as one of the finest craftsmen in the territory. His furniture and instruments sought after by families from as far away as Denver. Ada, for her part, never lost her love of music, and her mother's violin, played first at her own wedding and mended by the very hands that would come to hold her heart for the rest of her days, eventually passed to young Elena, who played it at her own wedding decades later, continuing the tradition begun by her grandmother in a distant German village, and carried across an ocean and half a continent to find its truest home on a Colorado mountainside. On the evening of their 25th wedding anniversary, Walter and Ada sat together on the porch of the cabin, now much expanded from its original simple structure to accommodate the family they had built together, watching their grown children and growing grandchildren play in the yard below, and Ada found herself thinking back to that terrible day beside the wrecked coach, when she had believed her mother's violin, and perhaps her own heart, broken beyond any hope of proper mending. "Do you ever think," she asked her husband, whose hair had gone gray at the temples but whose shoulders remained as broad and strong as they had been the day he pulled her from the mud beside that wrecked coach, about how different our lives would have been if that coach had never wrecked, if we had never met? Walter considered the question seriously, as he considered most things before answering. "I think," he said finally, "that some things are simply meant to happen, however painful the circumstances that bring them about. That coach wreck brought you pain and fear and the loss of something precious to you. But it also brought you to me, and brought me a family I had long since given up hoping to have. I would not wish the pain of that day on anyone, but I cannot regret where it led us in the end." "Nor can I," Ada agreed, leaning her head against his still broad shoulder, feeling the same solid strength and safety she had felt on that very first ride up the mountain trail, all those years before. "You mended more than just a violin that day, Walter Wallace. You mended a heart I did not even know was broken, until you showed me what it truly meant to be loved." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun set over the mountain peaks, the same peaks that had witnessed the beginning of their unlikely love story, now standing witness to its continued flourishing across a quarter-century of shared life. And as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Walter reached over and took his wife's hand in his own, the same rough, calloused, gentle hand that had first offered help to a stranger stranded beside a wrecked coach. And Ada thought that she had never imagined, on that terrible day when her world seemed to be falling apart, that she was in fact riding toward the greatest happiness of her entire life. Their son Thomas grew to inherit his father's workshop and his mother's gentle patience, eventually marrying a schoolteacher who had come west to teach at the growing town's expanding school. And their daughter Eleanor, true to her musical inheritance, eventually taught music to the children of Meridian Gulch, ensuring that the melody her grandmother had first played, and her mother had carried across half a continent, would continue to echo through the mountain community for generations yet to come. As for Walter Wallace, the mountain man who had once believed himself destined for a solitary life after love had disappointed him during the war, he lived to see his grandchildren grow, his workshop expand into a proper business employing several other craftsmen, and his marriage to Ada Keller deepen and strengthen with each passing year, proving that sometimes the most broken beginnings lead to the most complete and lasting happiness, if only two hearts are brave enough to trust in a love that arrives, unexpected and unplanned, on a muddy mountain trail beside the wreckage of what once seemed like an ending, but proved instead to be nothing more than the very beginning of everything that truly mattered. And on quiet evenings, even decades later, when the light fell just right through the cabin windows, and the mountain wind carried that particular hush that comes before snow, Ada would sometimes take up her mother's violin, now marked by the careful, invisible men that had first brought her together with the man who became her husband, and play that same waltz once more, filling their mountain home with music that spoke not just of a mother long past, but of a love that had proven, against every reasonable expectation, to be the truest and most lasting thing either Walter or Ada had ever known.